I think I find some peace in just continuing to do the stuff that I want to do that is for me and people like me, and just knowing that like I don't think my voice is wanted or needed in a 5e world. I don't think I have stuff to make those people happier, and I don't think I would be happy doing it.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I am Gary Snow, and with me is Adam Vass. And Adam has been prolific in his design. He's got an amazing Patreon, and he's been doing awesome work in the game design field. And I just want to say, Adam, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about all the many machines that drive this weird hobby job for me.
Well, we want to get into all those great games that you've been making. But first of all, as always, we got to ask how you even got started in this crazy business.
Yeah, I actually didn't grow up playing role-playing games like a lot of people. I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons until 2016. And I played 3.5 at this event that my local comic book shop was putting on. And it was at this brewery in town that used to be a church. So there's these big stained glass windows and a very like fantasy tavern aesthetic to it. And you would just come in for one night and play role-playing games. And that was my first exposure to it. Before that, I was into like playing strategy games and board games and stuff. And that was a very like pivotal moment for me insofar as experiencing a game that there was structure and there was rules, but there was this freedom to really do whatever you want and not necessarily worry about like the programmed entries that like if you were playing a video game, you can only do what they program. But in this, I could, squeeze someone's skulls in my hand until it broke, and like crazy extra stuff that you wouldn't expect someone to accommodate. And that was really eye-opening for me. So that began my journey, and it wasn't long. I think a lot of the time when I get into a hobby or entertainment, I like to pick it apart and see what makes it work and what makes certain things I like and certain things I don't like. And so if that was in January or February 2016, that summer I was already developing my own stuff and writing. And I think that fall is when I published my first role-playing stuff, which was the first edition of Babes in the Wood, and a letter writing solitaire game called All We Love We Leave Behind, that I was sort of working on both of those at the same time. And obviously those are pretty far off the beaten path already, and my journey from there just gets weirder and further out and more abstract. So I learned fast. I just dove head in and obsessed over it. And I was doing that part-time until the pandemic started and we were in quarantine. Before that, I was a touring musician since I was 19. And obviously with quarantine, there was no touring. So I went full-time with game design and publishing in 2020. And I've been doing that full-time since.
And what instrument did you play?
I play bass.
Oh, awesome. I have an upright bass that I never play but I bought it with the intention of playing. So
yeah,
you can try to determine my personality type based anyways, love the bass. So that's very cool. And in that environment, it's a very creative environment, and I can't help but draw some parallels between like rock posters and kind of the rock aesthetic and a lot of your games. How did your skills evolve over that time?
That's funny because that's definitely where a lot of my background comes from. I think visual art would come first. I always have drawn. I took every art class in school that I could. And a lot of that was based on outsider art, or I learned a lot from show posters and street art, and kind of, again, like not traditional, not fine art kind of pathway. I tend to like those outliers and those like freak approaches to traditional media. So as a teenager, I got super into that style of visual art, started getting into printmaking and screen printing, and was also playing music at the time. So, you know, I was designing my band's record covers, I was making posters, and I continue to do that now, but that really translated super easily for me with games and making, you know, book covers that don't look stock or like the last sort of 30 years of fantasy artwork. I want to be weird and I want to stand out, and I get to use a lot of these abstract educations that I got from hardcore music and from all of that necessity, and bring it into my game stuff, which offers it both I think a unique aesthetic visually, but also I bring those visual themes into gameplay and like the settings and stuff too. So it really permeates through my whole gaming mind, the grit of it, the Xerox copy of it, and the, you know, neck face freaks of it and that sort of stuff.
So tell me, when did World Champ Game Company kind of come into play in the naming of it and like the philosophy behind it, as far as like the aesthetic of even your game company?
Yeah, that was really a day one thing for me too. Comes back to that sort of parallel between like DIY culture and band and music culture and what I was bringing to gaming. I wanted to have a recognizable brand. I wanted to be, you know, the belt I think is very iconic and the monogram is very iconic. And it was important to me to start that early because those things tend to only work the more you use them. And so I wanted it on the back of every book. I wanted it on the, you know, inside cover always, to the extent that you would see that stamp and you would recognize I made that, and that, you know, if that's your thing, here's a little flag to say this one might also be your thing. So going again with that aesthetic first sort of approach, which I think was really rough at the start because I'm one person, I ship my games out of my office and my house. Like it almost presents this false like level that I'm not at, right? Calling it a company is sort of a lie. And on some level that's deliberate. I want people to take it seriously. I want it to be perceived as of a certain caliber. But in the same way, it can be damning where people expect more from me as an individual in terms of like shipping schedules or my ability to offer kind of, I guess, additional support. It is just me behind everything: design, illustration, layout, publishing, distribution, which is arguably too much, especially with the amount of games that I'm putting out there. So it's this interesting catch-22 where I want to be perceived as this professional person, but in doing so, it kind of diminishes some of the scrappier DIY qualities that I bring to my games.
Did it also have the problem of, because I encountered that a little bit too, is that as soon as you put, you know, game company, it takes the personality and your personal touch away from it. Like if it was Adam Vass Games, like people go, oh, I like that Adam Vass, I like his personality. But this World Champ Game Company, I don't like, who's working for them, like how many designers do they have,
right?
Kind of thing.
It's interesting because I think at the time I still have my personal social media accounts and stuff, and then I have the games ones, and in a lot of times I feel a lot more personal on the game account because the industry is small, because it's much more of a communal feeling than just like a person in existence. So I get a lot, I think I imbue World Champ with that personality that I don't get to do as much in everyday life. So I think while I do lose some aspect of it by being a name, I've heard people, you know, say like they love World Champ stuff. I have, you know, shirts that say World Champ on it. It it to me feels like it's this happy middle ground of still being hyper personal because I put so much of myself into the games that I make, while still offering enough distance that like it would be weird to see someone else wearing a shirt with my name on it. But with my brand, it feels like a separation enough that I appreciate that they're supporting my work without necessarily the projection or assumption of my individual personality.
And were you a wrestling fan?
Yeah, that's where it comes from for the most part. I have been a big wrestling fan for a long time. I'm actually a little out of it now, mostly just because I don't have access to stuff anymore. But I lived in Boston for 4 or 5 years and was doing a lot of graphic design, partnership with a wrestling promotion out there in Providence. That was like right before I started doing game stuff. So that was very front of my mind when I started World Champ.
There's a lot of, I mean, I'm like an old school territory wrestling fan. I love that
Yeah,
kind of era of wrestling. But there's so much crossover. I think a lot of like, people that like tabletop role playing games tend to like kind of wrestling because I guess it's that the story behind it. And I mean,
totally.
I mean, obviously wrestling's not real. I mean, kayfabe and all that, but there's a certain amount of like, okay, we know it's not real, but we're going to have fun with it no matter what,
Totally.
right?
And I think that's really, you have to have that sort of ability to check out, to really immerse yourself in like the fun aspects of role playing. And on some level, a wrestler is a role player. They're playing the role of their character and they're acting out this stuff. It is a LARP, but yeah, I think that's why there's so much commonality, is this appreciation for story and character and immersion that goes into both styles of play.
And when did you end up like making that first game? Like, do you remember, like, did you have a bunch of them on the go at any given time, or was there one that just was your first and your baby?
I did a few card games before that weren't role playing oriented. And it was fun, but it's so much more difficult because it has to be so much more airtight than a role playing game, which it expects the player to fill in the blanks and make it work in a different way. So Babes in the Wood and All We Love We Leave Behind were my first role playing games, and I worked on them at the same time, even though they're thematically so different. Because I just wasn't sure. I wasn't sure what I was doing or what I was going to do with them. At the time, I was self-publishing zines. I wasn't a member of a community necessarily. I had not gone to game conventions, or I didn't really know anybody else who was doing anything. So I very hesitant. I was interested in making stuff, and my friends and I would play it, but I didn't necessarily have delusions of grandeur on people I didn't know playing them or even having them. Just had zines in my backpack, like I kind of always have. So yeah, it was an interesting segue from that to publisher.
Did you have any games that kind of inspired you, or like I know it was Babes in the Wood is kind of powered by the apocalypse and that
Yeah.
set or structure, I guess.
So the original edition of Babes in the Wood was pretty much a reskin of Dungeon World, which was kind of my first foray into more indie role-playing stuff from Dungeons and Dragons. And it's funny too, because I've never been a fantasy person, but that's obviously the biggest hook. So going from D&D to Dungeon World to then a very like open indie arena was a quick plunge for me, because I wanted to latch on to something thematically and aesthetically that I liked more than traditional fantasy. So at that time, yeah, like this was 2016, so Dungeon World was it for me. I got a copy of Downfall. That was one of my first indie games that I really loved. and Fiasco was a big eye opener for me, especially in this is a game that tells stories and not necessarily this is a game about winning or combat or like the kind of more mechanical aspects of role playing that I was lured in with. Fiasco was the switch for me of knowing what I want to do, what I enjoy about this, and how I could kind of further my education in this world and continue that path of, I guess, more story focused stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I can see that in a number of your games, that Fiasco
Totally.
kind of inspiration, where it's like you can just have a like basically a party and have people
Yeah.
sitting around the table playing a game.
Yeah, that's definitely a vibe I like. And I think Fiasco does this excellent job too of everyone, it sets expectation really well at the start, and you still get to be surprised and impressed by the way that it goes, which feels more like you doing it than it does the game telling you what to do. And that's so interesting and masterful to me that that's what I aspire most of my games to do, is get out of the way on some level and give you the starting push of, get weird with this, and then not prevent you from getting as weird as you want to.
It's that whole emergent storytelling, and a lot of your games are also leaning into like almost GM-less, where it's
Yeah.
players only.
Yeah, I tend to like that more when I play because uh I don't know, there's something to just exercising that creativity that GMless games all have. And when one player has that light bulb moment that's about to change the story for everybody, it feels so cool. And I don't want that feeling to be behind this screen of one player gets to sort of pull these strings. So that shared responsibility, that shared power is really interesting to me, both in terms of how it can affect the story and just like how you as players feel afterwards. Like I loved when you did that and I got to do this, and like we all kind of contributed in a really meaningful way.
And so you started developing like tinier games, like kind of like we just discussed, and like kind of small pieces. And when did you go, okay, I'm going to start a Patreon to have like a pay per creation of these games?
Yeah, that was around this a few months later. Patreon was relatively new and I was new to it. But it was this interesting idea to me of like, since I'm making smaller things and I'm making them kind of, I guess, without intent or without a direction, I just make something. And as you mentioned, like I'm pretty prolific insofar as if I have an idea, I see it through and I get it out there. So Patreon was a way for me to do that, especially at the time I was doing a lot of postcard sized games or one-page games. And that was just a fun thing for me to do. And that was a way for me to also learn that there were people who were interested in that and cared about what I was making. That could help facilitate me making more of them and not having this be sort of a flash in the pan for me, where I do a couple things and no one really cares and then I kind of walk away from it. So I think I launched the Patreon in maybe 2017, and was doing a game a month for until last year. I think was the first time I missed a month. So one release every month for 5 years, plus my bigger tentpole games.
Did you find it a lot of pressure to produce one a month? Were there months that you were just like, yeah, like, I mean, the one that you missed, like, did you go, I don't have it in me, or I've got other things that I'm too busy to do? One?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I only charge people when I release something, but it just so happens to be every month. Um, so if I don't make something in a month, I don't get paid that money. And so in that way, there is a financial pressure on me to continue making stuff, especially now that I have more patrons and I take it more seriously. I make higher quality stuff and all my patrons get it, which is awesome. But the sort of cost benefit analysis of that has always been skewed of like, if I get more people and I spend more money on printing it and shipping it, I'm not necessarily making more, but if I don't put something out, then I am losing what I would have made. So I think that pressure is internal. I think it's me putting it on myself. My backers have never been upset if I missed a month or if I need extra time or whatever. And the times that I've missed, I think I've missed more since I broke the streak. It's been harder to stay on the monthly, which is, I think, a good thing, because I was just so burnt out and didn't notice that I was doing 3 or 4 full-scale Kickstarter projects a year with 12 monthly projects that were smaller. And that's just bananas. Like, that's so much art. It's so much just thinking. Like, my brain just was never off. And so much shipping and just like so many logistic things to putting that much stuff out, that it did get to a point where I was like, if I'm doing a Kickstarter this month, I can't make a zine also. Even though the zines are fun, I get a different kind of joy from that. It just became a self-awareness thing to stop doing it every month, or to try to make sure I'm in check with myself, that I have the ability, the time, the mental strength, the money to put these things out. And if I don't, then I'm at least aware enough now to let myself know it's okay to miss one.
And you mentioned, just the whole creative process. When you come up with an idea, like, can you walk me through the steps of like from that ideation piece to like finish? Like, how long does it take? Like, do you make notes, or do you ruminate on it for like quite a while before it comes to life?
It's obviously, with so many projects, the process is different in a lot of different ways. But typically for like a Patreon level game, it's funny because very often I limit myself to a week, and I say, if I have an idea on Friday, I want it written by Monday, and I want to go to print by the next Friday. And if it's not able to do that, if it's going to take more than that, then it goes into this sort of ether of, can I cut this down for Patreon, or should I build this up to be a air quotes real book? But I often start with the story I want to tell. And very, very often that comes from records and movies and kind of external media that I'm putting through my brain filter and blending it up and trying to find component parts and make it mine. A lot of the time too, that thing, that spark, can be like a piece of art I see on Instagram, or sometimes it's layout. Like my most recent Patreon release is called Lucid, and I made it starting with this text grid that I saw in like a magazine that was interesting to me, that I wanted to kind of dissect. And I didn't know what the game was going to be about or what it was going to look like, but I knew I wanted to mess with these like hard columns and really tight text formatting. And so I kind of worked my way backwards from there for a theme and for a setting, and then forwards again with the art and the mechanics. It's always just a big stew for me, and there's no necessarily way of starting here and going XYZ in step. But I would say, yeah, figuring out my story is the first thing, and that usually also comes attached to an aesthetic, because I'm picturing the world, or I'm picturing the story that's taking place, the characters, or whatever visual component that I can then turn into art that is representative of the game, that brings the reader into that world, and then the mechanics that will support that style of play that I'm envisioning. And even just diagnosing what that is. If it's a game where you fight stuff, if it's a game where you're just telling a story together, or not that those are mutually exclusive, but mechanically they work differently, and I want to make sure that my skeletons always match the goal of, I guess, the meat. And unfortunately, that often also means system design from scratch. A lot of my Patreon games, definitely most of my Kickstarter games, but a lot of the Patreon ones too, come with like whole cloth new mechanical systems. They can be inspired by other stuff, but I'm not a big hacker. I'm trying to let myself be that now this year and take a little bit of weight off my shoulders by starting with something that is a little more built instead of from scratch.
So in that decision making process of like, okay, how do I build it from scratch, does the content just inform the mechanics where you're like, you know what, I thought I could do it with this, but you know what, I'm going to have to switch it? It's just like any design process, you figure out what works for it.
Yeah, and I think the style of play that I'm going for is the most informational thing that leads to mechanical system design for me. So, for example, my game Cobwebs is a conspiracy horror game, and you take turns as the investigator, and you're looking for someone who's missing. And as you do, you uncover more and more of this conspiracy horror. And so I knew, this is sort of an abstract thought, but like I wanted it to feel almost physically that you as the players were going through this spiral. So the game is played on this playmat that is a circle, and it has tokens that go around it to measure time, like how much time is left in the game. And it also has you putting dice and tokens and cards on top of the playmat that are getting pulled towards this gravity, towards the center, which feels like this inevitable danger or collapse. And so much of that play experience is that the revolving around the circle and getting sucked into that gravity, and how that is rhyming with your character's journey of looking and getting pulled into this conspiracy, and by the time they're aware of it, it's too late to get out of it.
I love the layout for that, and it's got, without looking too much like it, it had like that Alfred Hitchcock Saul Bass kind of vibe to it, which in the D12 for the calendar, essentially, I thought it was very clever mechanics and design integrated with each other. Which I have to say, I mean, I'm not going to try to pump your tires too much, but it's like all of your stuff. Like, I mean, I have to say, like, I'm very jealous of a lot of your games. Like you've been able to come up with so many. Like, I mean, unfortunately I didn't count how many titles you have, but it's got to be getting close to like 24, 25.
I've never counted, but off the top of my head, I would think it would be a lot more than that, especially with the monthly Patreon stuff. Because some stuff's out of print now and some stuff was digital only or whatever. But I would say I have at least 60 games.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they're all unique,
years.
and they all have their kind of special vibe to it. And you talked about like the actual process of the like design. What software and apps do you use to create this, or do you start with stock art and just manipulate it after that?
I have the benefit of, having studied art for most of my life. So a lot of my art starts on paper with ink, especially, stuff like Necronautilus or my most recent crowdfunded project, Cyber Metal 2012. Every piece of Cyber Metal art was done in ink and scanned in. So, and that's a 140 plus page book with art on almost every page. So there's dozens of illustrations with ink that I scan in, and I'll color them in Photoshop and add textures and stuff and make it more print friendly and aesthetic forward. So most of my visual stuff I do in Photoshop. I use InDesign to do text layout. I'm definitely not an InDesign expert. I'm lucky because my job pays for my Adobe subscription. There was a while during COVID where I was trying to teach myself how to use Affinity, because I recognized that someday I'm probably going to lose the Creative Cloud subscription, and I should learn. And I'm not comfortable there yet. I'm not as in tune with it as I am with Adobe stuff, because I started learning Photoshop at 13 in my computer graphics class, like stealing the disc, the CD from my school and installing it on my home computer. So it's something that is second nature. It's another language, and I've been studying it forever. So, and with that said, I know how to do the things I know how to do. So coloring drawings that I've done or sketching and that kind of stuff comes really easy to me. Whereas photo manipulation and that kind of, obviously those programs have these really wide skill set libraries. I'm not as trained in, but I'm very honed on the things I know how to do that cater to my style specifically. So yeah, for the most part, that's what I use Photoshop in design. I do use Illustrator quite a bit when I'm making titles. I do a lot of hand lettering and a lot of custom lettering for my games, like Necronautilus. The logo is, of course, like metal inspired, but that was drawn and then made a vector in Illustrator. Same with some of my more abstract stuff like ether operations, where that was like a case study of how illegible can I make this type, but still be evocative and neat. So that's been a thing more recently within the last like 3 years of bringing my lettering fascination into games too, and not just using fonts, or like I use a lot of fonts I find online or buy, but lately I've been trying to make my own too. And I had a game I started about 2 years ago called Hell War that it was like I was building a custom font for the headers and stuff with the intent of giving the font as part of the game file. So when people wanted to design supplements, it would have the same visual language. That stuff's really interesting to me now, and like becoming more important the more I solidify my own kind of niche in games as something that I can do that I really like doing that maybe not everyone can do, but can help other designers do cool stuff too.
Would you ever conceive of doing just the art or just the writing? I know you've mentioned, for Patreon, if people submit, you can like outsource some of the artwork and that kind of thing. But I have to ask, your work is so unique and so personable to you. And I know you've frequently collaborated with Will Jobs on a few things, but how much control do you feel comfortable giving up with any project?
Yeah, I think the sort of curse of satisfaction is the thing that drives so much of my work, in that I have to do the visuals to match the writing, to match the mechanics, to match the physical product. Like, and that comes from an unwillingness or I guess I would call it inability, but I don't think that's entirely true, to defer control or to compromise on the thing that I can see in my head, this finished product that I can picture in my head. I think I have, last year I did just art for a supplement for Morkborg called Fiskborg that was written by Richard Kelly. And that was just like a crime of convenience, where I knew Richard was writing these fish knitting games for Morkborg, and I could do that style of ink sprayed terror. So we teamed up on that, and it was super dreamy. But that was, I think, the first time I'd ever done art for someone else's game book. I did the layout too, and it was still a lot of work, but not writing it was huge for me, huge for my brain too, because that was a weird time for me. And I also was moving from California back to Michigan at that time, so I wasn't entirely I didn't have my roots in yet. So that was really nice. And then there are other instances, like when Will and I made Campfire last year, which is our anthology horror story game. We wanted to work with Trevor Henderson for the illustrations because Trevor is such a horror guru. And I love horror, Will loves horror, but Trevor is on another level of understanding. And had a very similar vision to us of what we wanted that to be. And I got to still flex some of my muscles with the graphic design on the interior, but the packaging design and the playmat design for that was all Trevor. And it ended up being much more than the sum of its parts. I couldn't have pulled that game off on my own, and I wouldn't have wanted to. So it ends up benefiting from the collaboration a lot. And I recognize that when I do collaborate, it feels really good and I really like it. But especially with Patreon, where I don't have budget, and I'm not trying to short anybody, you know, I want to make sure everybody's getting taken care of on a project. Sometimes I recognize that I just have to do it myself to save the money. And sometimes I still end up really happy with what I make when I do that concession, even though sometimes there's an artist I really would love to work with that I just can't manage the budget for.
And how did you and Will connect in the first place?
Will and I met at a zine meetup at, I think it was Gen Con. It was either Gen Con or Origins in 2018, I think. And yeah, it was just this sort of random thing I saw on Twitter, like Zinester meetup at the hotel lobby or whatever. And 5 people maybe showed up because this was before Kickstarter was doing Zine Quest, and there was like really a Zinester culture. I mean, there always has been, but before zines was like a big thing in RPGs. So the people that were there were already kind of like my people, especially at a convention, which can skew very corporate and very like hustly. This was artists and outsiders and weirdos making weird stuff. And we traded and just became fast friends. And shortly after that, we both did the first Zine Quest on Kickstarter separately, just coincidentally. And a few months after that, when I was moving to California, a friend of mine was driving the van and it was raining in Colorado, and I was kind of drifting in and out of sleep and had this idea to do a game, like to kickstart a game that didn't exist. And I knew Will was the person I wanted to do that with, because it was weird and out there and people weren't doing it, and it was a huge risk, and they were very about that. And that was the beginning of our like games partnership of working together on a very regular basis. And Will's my best friend now, so it's just one of those strange perfect storms of like being in the same place at the same time and having a similar interest and wanting to do weird artsy projects. It really facilitated our design partnership really well. And now we did that game. It was called A Guide to Casting Phantoms in the Revolution. It's out of print now. That was right before COVID hit too. So since then we did the Brain Trust podcast, where we do game design stuff almost every week. Well, we were weekly for a while, and then we both just sort of burnt out and took a little break. But designing stuff and talking designing theory and that sort of thing on the podcast. We have the Discord server, the Brain Trust 2, which is just a designer community where we riff and hang out and kind of just sharpen each other's blades, and that feels really good. But Will's easily my number one collaborator. We work super well together. We have this chemistry that I've never had with another creative person. That's just really invigorating. And then we both really love just seeing it through too. It's not enough to just have the idea. We usually take them to their logical conclusions, and that tends to be these big boxed print games that are, I would say, pretty different than really what anybody else is doing in the indie RPG world right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like pretty fascinating, the whole process that you've been under between Patreon and Kickstarter, and like in Patreon too, you print, you have a level for,
oh yeah,
and that's got to be
me for
that's tough
for sure. But that's, like I said, growing up in music and hardcore, and it's the difference between a record and a download. You know, like you want that disc in your hand, you want that full album art, you want the lyric booklet, or even just going to a show, you want the shirt or the like the memorabilia aspect of it. There's a collector's aspect to it. As you could tell behind me, I have quite a collection of. I just like to own stuff and touch things and have all this sort of ephemera that comes with them, and that's what I really want my games to be too. I want them to be these physical artifacts of play. I want them to be cherished, but I also want them to be at the bottom of your bag and they get destroyed because you just keep putting new stuff in your bag, but you always like have it around. And there's just something to that, you know, like Linus's dirty blanket or whatever, like it's more yours, and there's some real charm to that. But yeah, it comes from so many places. I mentioned too, I was into screen printing and printmaking. So when I got into doing like risograph stuff, I took a class on printing risograph and made a game called Diagnostics. It's like part of my class, and got to print that myself. Got like did the whole thing from hand painted to scanned in to print to ship, like with my hands, and that's the satisfaction I get. I'm not a big digital file person. I'm not a big like download. Even when I pick up PDFs from Itch or whatever, I usually print them and make my own zines and add that to my collection, because that's the way I engage with the media, and I want people to engage with my stuff that way.
And speaking of Itch and all the different platforms that you do sell on and Patreon, and what kind of works for you? Like, what have you found? Like, what's the secret formula for you? Or are you still trying to hone in on that?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a consequence of what I was just talking about, but really the only thing that works for me on a regular basis that I can rely on is my own website store, just worldchamp.io, where people can just buy games and I ship the games to them. I guess the second thing that's reliable would be Patreon, because it's been so fruitful for so long that people will stay on and people respect what I do there, and that's really great. But I do have digital stuff on Itch, and I have some stuff. Most of my catalog is digital, also on Drive-Thru RPG, but I get almost nothing from digital sales relative to my physical sales. And that's because I am a print first designer. I don't think that's because I'm doing a bad job necessarily, but I want you to have the book. And I also will give people downloads if they buy a book from my store too. So it's kind of like, it's as a audience member, the best way to get everything you want at a still a good price. I think I undercharge a lot of the time because it comes from that punk rock ethos of wanting everyone to have it and not worrying about how much it costs, and trying to do sliding scale pricing on some of my bigger books. So, you know, if you can afford to pay extra, you can offset the cost for someone who can't afford it. And just sort of the idea that games are a luxury and games are a privilege to read and to play and to own. So trying to make that as accessible as possible. And part of that includes being on every platform that I can. So because there's not a lot, I guess there's more crossover now between people who use Itch and Drive-Thru, but they used to be very different audiences. And I still want both audiences to have access to my stuff. So I would just clone stuff, have it in multiple places. And I think that's good advice for anybody doing self-publishing, is just have it available in every place that you can. And obviously Drive-Thru's cut is a lot higher than Itch's, and there are other places like Gumroad if you wanted to have your own like hosted download space, or I just use Squarespace for my website. That's my store. But just having it in as many places as possible, you will find people will find your stuff much easier. And if they dig it, they might, you know, click through and find out more about you and find your other games and want to do that deep dive with you.
And do you have like a go-to printer that you use all the time, or do you?
I have a lot. I have a lot of printers, mostly because I do different formats pretty often. Um, in 2020, I did a game on a face mask. Like it was like a 3 sentence game, and it was printed on a cloth face mask that you could wear. And that's obviously a different printer that I would get my zines from. I've done a couple games on scratch off tickets. Um, that's its own bespoke print shop. There's a place in my town called Brownlee Press that does zine printing and poster printing. And so I'll go there, especially because it's down the street from where my partner works. So I'll just pop in, get something printed that day, and have it that night. Like that's a real great privilege for me. Um, I use Mixum fairly often, like a lot of people do for zine printing, and Jukebox, which is in Canada, which is a very similar quality and price point. Um, yeah, I just have. It also comes from, again, the music industry of like I can source product printing real easy and get a good price and know where it's coming from, know my timeline and my budget line, and that's a skill I didn't realize that I was developing for a very long time doing band merch, but has come in with doing World Champ really, really great.
And do you have like boxes and boxes of books kind of in a bedroom waiting to just
Yeah, so
bought?
I mean, even yeah, again, behind me, this is all a campfire. And since it's a box game, it takes up a lot more space. But in my closet, in my office, I have all of my zines in the IKEA square shelves. Um, whereas hardcover books, they come in cases, and I just have stacks of cases. Currently in my dining room, because I just reprinted Necronautilus after it went out of print. But I'm very, very slowly moving those to storage and dealing with cases on a more as needed basis, especially because Cyber Metal 2012 is coming soon, and that's going to also be probably 40 cases of books, maybe more. Yeah, it's taking I am lucky I bought my house, and so there's no shortage of rooms, but right now every room is filled with cases of books.
And the shipping part of it, like how do you achieve that? Because to me that's almost overwhelming as far as like, do you have like envelopes everywhere or postage machine or?
I have this next to the zines and stuff in the closet. I also have every kind of mailer. I got the bubble mailer, the flat mailer, the boxes of different sizes, and it's an organized chaos. On top of those shelves is like all the poly bags, so I can keep things safe from water damage. My scale, my stickers, because I throw stickers in all my orders and that kind of stuff. Over here, I've got the label printer and tape gun and all that stuff. So it's a non-linear assembly line in here.
Well, I know. I mean, you are essentially a one man band, so to speak.
Totally.
You're doing everything from the writing to the layout to the sales to the shipping to. Um, do you ever go? You know what? I'm just going to go work for somebody that's doing a 5e product, and I'll be happy there.
I often wonder if that would be the case, or if I would be left wanting more something that's more creatively satisfying. Um, I actually just last year started working at the farmers market one day a week, and that to me of like, this does not engage my brain in the way that my creative work does, and it is invigorating to me. It feels amazing because I'm not attached to the product. I don't I am happy if someone buys it, but I'm not hurt if they don't. And because I just am in the Midwest, and people are friendlier enough, and they just say hi on a Saturday morning. That's something that I'm not getting in my office as I work by myself most of the time. And in those down moments when the market's slower is when my brain starts to churn, and sometimes I'll work a 6-hour shift and come home with my like little my pocket notebook has a full game in it, and I can develop that. And my sort of idle brain at work came up with that, and it's different than that full immersion. I have to do everything on this really grand scale kind of development that I often do on my own. So yeah, I often wonder if there was a way that I could take a step back and still feel happy. And so much of my self-worth, I think, comes from that ability to create and that desire to have ideas and see them to fruition, that I don't think I could do less than what I'm doing. But then when I start to get those burnout symptoms, I'm dying to know what I can do less to survive that pursuit of my idea.
Is there like a roadmap for you in your head where you go, I've always wanted to try this, or I have a few like big tentpole games that I'm kind of thinking of, and what's the future hold for you?
I don't know. That's a good question. I am going back to touring. I mentioned at the start, I was a touring musician before COVID, and I have one booked for this fall for the first time since 2019. And I think that's going to alleviate a lot of the pressure that I put on myself to be this way productive publisher. Partly because I won't be able to ship because I'll be gone for however many weeks. And also in part because it's not the sole source of my income anymore. And that's a massive relief. And I think on some level that will benefit that sort of pure creativity that I'm wanting more than this sort of grind of doing 4 Kickstarters a year plus 12 monthly games that I just need to be able to afford my life. That was never really my intent. That was a COVID concession that I made, and it was still, to me, better than abandoning those creative hopes and doing something more mundane or stable. And it worked out this long, but yeah, I flirt with burnout really often. Even this year, I did the Cyber Metal 2012 crowdfund in January, and last month I did a crowdfund for another game called Soul Burner that I'm writing now. So that's 2, and it's not June yet. That's what most people do in a year, if that, and they're both full scale, full production books. So I kind of lost the plot on this one, but I am spinning a lot of plates, and I often think I like spinning plates, but I would like maybe just a couple less.
Do you find, and you don't, maybe it's prying too much into your life a bit, so apologize for that, but you are obviously successful, love your games, I think they're amazing, but in my head I go, why aren't you more successful? Because like it's awesome work. And do you ever kind of get frustrated as far as like your stuff could be like so prominent, that iconic actually? Do you ever kind of feel like, how come I'm not getting more? And you're successful, don't get me wrong, but how come not more?
Truthfully, I think that often, because it's such a crapshoot to see what games stick and what ones don't. Cyber Metal 2012 only pre-sold about 300 copies, whereas Necronautilus did 1,000 in Kickstarter. And part of that, I think, was because it wasn't on Kickstarter, it was on GameFound, and that was sort of a mess and its own sort of experiment that arguably failed. But yeah, I get that a lot. I get jealous a lot of seeing people sell more and do less. I think that's normal, that you're comparing yourself to other people. And I can definitely fall victim to that, like, what if mentality, like what am I doing wrong that's not resonating with people, or how am I not finding this audience? Because something like cyber metal to me is the coolest thing I can think of. So why doesn't anybody connect with that or think it's as cool as I do? And I think I find some peace in just continuing to do the stuff that I want to do, that is for me and people like me, and just knowing that, like, I don't think my voice is wanted or needed in a 5e world. I don't think I have stuff to make those people happier, and I don't think I would be happy doing it. So I get to stay true to that creative spark. I get to make freaky stuff, and I might be cutting out 80% of my potential audience, but that 20% that's left are people who want weirder, more artsy, more out there stuff, and they're going to come back to me. Like, they're going to see that that's what I am through and through, and hopefully connect with that. You know, I want someone who picks up Necronautilus to come back and get Cyber Metal, because they share DNA, but they're very different things. And if you like one, you're probably going to like the other, because I'm the sort of curator of this whole brand and my design. It can be frustrating when I look at it in a numerical sense, and especially, like I said, when I went full-time as a game publisher, when I didn't necessarily want to, but COVID sort of forced my hand, then it forced me to just look at things in a sales oriented way. And that was not healthy, and that was not satisfying as a creative person. But obviously I can't afford to be a creative person if nothing is selling. So I think I've kind of found a happy middle ground there. I still get to make stuff. I still can take some risks, but I've also worked at this long enough that I've established an audience that trusts that I'm going to do a good job with the weird stuff that I'm messing with.
Well, I like, and from the interviews that I've done, the one thing that I've noticed over time is there's no such thing as an overnight success. And
Yeah.
a lot of hard work goes into that. So if for my money, hopefully, you know, interviews like this can help, because like I said, you're doing amazing work. I think it's pretty innovative. You're probably one of the more innovative designers that I've seen out there. So take that for what it's worth.
I appreciate that. I like to think those things of myself, but it feels obviously very good when somebody else tells me that too.
Well, just want to say, you know, thanks again for joining me today. And who's with you?
This is Beans. He started crying. I thought it would absolve the noise if he came in, but now he's trying to kick my ass. So,
well, thank you to Beans for letting you talk to us for a little bit today. And I'm going to have all your links in the description and the show notes. And I encourage people to check out some of the stuff that you're doing. And, you know, once again, well done, amazing work. Hope to see more of it in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know what is next, but there's always something next. I'm always working on 8 things at the same time. So